Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Clinton Academy. The East Hampton Historical Society has enjoyed doing these lectures this winter, and every month the crowd gets bigger, which is really nice to see. Tonight we're very privileged to have two gentlemen coming to speak to us about the Dominy family. The Dominy family was a very prominent family in East Hampton many years ago, which you'll learn more about as they speak tonight. Hugh King, let's see, what can I tell you about Hugh King? Actually, I can tell you a lot of stories about Hugh King, but I won't get into that right now because I don't want to take his time up. I've known Hugh almost all of my life, I think, because we both grew up out here and we did community theater together years ago, and so our paths have crossed many times. About 8 years ago, I guess it was, wasn't it, Hugh, when I got you involved in walking tours?
The walking tours?
We decided at the Historical Society we needed somebody to do a walking tour of the historic district, and I suggested Hugh because I knew he was retiring from school teaching. And as you know, he's made quite a career out of that now. He's the official town crier, and he's also the village historian. He's the person that will take you on a tour if you go over to Home Sweet Home. He's a site manager there. He's a wealth of information. He knows so much about the history of East Hampton. So we're really excited to have him talk to us tonight. And he's brought with him Evan Thomas, who is a master woodworker. And he will be talking to us about probably the tools and some of the pieces of the Dominy collection that we have here in the Historical Society. So, Hugh, take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you all of you for coming. And Evan and I would like to thank the East Hampton Historical Society for sponsoring tonight's talk and bringing out many of these Dominy pieces that you see here. They had been lugged all over the place, and they brought them here. And of course, the tools from the collection, they are not Dominy tools, but as Evan is going to tell you, they're tools that the Dominies could have used. I really want to thank my sweet wife, Loretta, for not only typing my manuscript for 5 hours yesterday and having the computer eat it. She spent all day today typing it up, and not only did she type it up, she enlarged the print. Okay? And you're going to see it's a good thing she did, okay? I'd also like to thank former East Hampton Town historian Carlton Kelsey for sharing lots of his information about the Dominies, and co-town historian Cheryl Foster for sharing their information about the Dominy family. So if there's anything wrong, you know where to go. Now, I am not an expert on the Dominy family or on Dominy Furniture. Aren't you glad you came? But there are people who were and who are, and I'm going to be telling you what they have said about the Dominy family, okay? If you want to know lots of things about the Dominy family, of course, you go to Hammer in Hand, okay? The book by Charles Hummel. You visit the Long Island room of the East Hampton Library, or you go to the Winterthur Museum in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, however, Evan is an expert on how tools are used and how furniture is made, so we've divided our talk into several parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about the Dominy family. Evan is going to talk about the tools and how the furniture was made using the tools. Then we'll answer some questions, and then you can have time to come up and look at the pieces and look at the tools, and that should take us to about midnight, okay? Okay. The last person who came here to speak, the last lecture you had, told me he mentioned my name during his talk. So I'm going to mention his name tonight, Robert Hefner. Okay? Okay. Thank you. Now, are there any members of the Dominy family here tonight? Look at that, okay? Are there any people in here who have Dominy furniture? Okay. Are there any people in here who remember the Domini House and the shops? Okay. And how many people here have visited the Winterthur Museum in Wilmington? All right. Okay. Okay. So I guess we don't need to talk. You people are all set. All right. For more than 100 years, 4 generations of the Dominy family were able to support themselves and their families with their craftsmanship. Because virtually no records or products documented to Nathaniel Dominy III, 1714-1778, who was a carpenter and a surveyor, have survived, we're going to focus on a father, a son, and a grandson. Nathaniel Dominy IV, Nathaniel Dominy V and Felix Dominy. Now, part of the reason for their success is that they were in the right place at the right time. By the time Nathaniel IV began working, his family had lived in East Hampton for almost 100 years. The first Nathaniel settled here about 1669. He was only 21 years after the town's founding. The house in which Nathaniel IV lived was built about 1715, 45 years before he became a craftsman on North Main Street on the road that led up to 3 Mile Harbor and the Long Island Sound. Now, you know where this was, right across from the present historical landmark, the IGA, okay? There's a boulder over there, all right? And on the boulder, there's a little plaque. That's where the Domini House stood, okay, and the shops. The Dominy males had married into local families such as the Edwards, Baker, and Miller. In short, they were a known and trusted family. They were also a known quantity as producer of goods. Nathaniel II was a weaver and a surveyor, the latter always an important service in a agricultural community. He supervised the building of the town's first poorhouse and was a partner in a local sawmill. Nathaniel IV was a joiner, house and barn carpenter, turner, millwright, coffin maker, clock maker, and a repairer of guns, jewelry, and watches. And I cannot believe that this place, Clinton Academy, built in 1785, did not have a Dominy work on it. Okay? Come on. Okay. His son, Nathaniel V, was a cabinet maker, joiner, turner, millwright, wheelwright, coffin maker, and repairer of small boats. And Felix Dominy, Nathaniel V's son, was a clockmaker, jeweler, and watch repairer, and general metalworker. What the local community needed in the way of woodwork or metalwork, furniture, house and mill carpentry, clocks, watch repair, agricultural tools, spinning wheels, coffins, and more, the Dominys provided this for well over 100 years. The family was fortunate. Like most craftsmen producing goods in the 18th and early 19th century, they lived in a rural region. The assessment roll of the town of East Hampton for 1814 notes that the Dominys owned 100 acres of land, and this is a key point that we're going to come to later. Now, land. Dean Faley, who is associated with, I always want to say the Society for the Prevention of Long Island, but it's the Society for the Preservation of Long Island Antiquities, says that by the 18th century, most of the land in this area out here in East Hampton was pretty much grabbed and taken up, so there was no incentive for another craftsman to come out here and work. So the Dominies had this place pretty much for themselves, but there were other craftspeople working out here on the eastern end of Long Island. Every piece that's attributed to the eastern end of Long Island, people say it's a Dominy piece, and that's not true, okay? Doesn't mean they were bad people, okay? Okay. City craftsmen in colonial America were generally forced to purchase food and other basic necessities of living. Thus, their overhead costs were higher than their counterparts working in the rural areas, and you're going to come to find out the Dominies did not have that problem, okay? Because they did other things besides working on furniture, and they used the barter system, okay? All right, in short, they were a well-known, respected local family, full-service craftsmen whose activities were supported by a 100-acre farm, a recipe for success. Aren't these words nice? I didn't write them, okay? This is taken from an article that Mr. Charles Hummel wrote, okay, in 1998 for the 350th anniversary of the town. I was going to wait to the end to tell you that, but I'll tell you that now. All right, outside East Hampton, the Dominies provided services to customers in Flushing, Huntington, Islip, Moriches, Patchogue, Quogue, Riverhead, Smithtown, Southold, and at least 8 other towns on Long Island. They also had clients in Haddam, Hartford, Lyme, New Haven, Saybrook, Stonington, and Wethersfield, Connecticut. A short sail across Gardens Bay and Long Island Sound. Sometimes they would travel to seek additional work. In 1795, Nathaniel IV credited Nathaniel Dayton with 12 shillings for the use of Dayton's mare on a clock tour to Mastic. In 1809, he advertised in the Suffolk Gazette a tour to the western parts of this country for the purpose of repairing clocks. I think he probably meant county, not country. Okay, they weren't that far-reaching. Another key to the Domini's success was the fact that there was always a substantial number of years during which a father and a son worked together. Very important. This enabled them to specialize and increase production. I think it also enabled them to pass the tools along. Okay, very, very important. Nathaniel IV had received sufficient training to have been working on his own by 1758, but his father did not die until 1778, thus enabling Nathaniel IV to concentrate on making clocks, repairing both clocks and watches, as well as other metalwork. Then Nathaniel III, the carpenter surveyor, focused on woodwork. When young Nathaniel V, began working in about 1789, his father was able to concentrate again on metalwork, clockwork, and watch and clock repair till his death in 1812. Young Nathaniel focused on woodwork until Nathaniel IV died, and then adding metalwork until his son Felix took on metalwork, clockwork, and watch repair in 1817. So you see there was an unbroken string here between those three people. From 1769 through 1827, Nathaniel IV and Felix kept a record of all watches coming into their shop for repair, including the names of some of their owners, makers, and serial numbers. Altogether, there were 4,600 entries representing 1,983 owners. It was an incredibly lucrative business that accounted for a significant part of the Dominy's income. Because their names appear prominently on dials of clocks made on North Main Street, the Dominy craftsmen had been primarily known as clockmakers. But close examination of their records and surviving products indicate they earned more from furniture production and watch repair than from clockmaking. At least 936 pieces of furniture were made in the Dominy woodworking shop between 1760 and 1840. But let's not go crazy here. They only made about 13 or 14 pieces of furniture a year. And they only made about 1.5 clocks a year. First of all, clocks were expensive. You know, it could be a couple of months' wages to buy one of their clocks. Okay? But we have and the other reason, of course, is that the Dominies, it looks like they produced a lot of furniture, but they have other things to do. They did other things besides make furniture. They have 100 acres of land supposedly to take care of. Okay? Okay, Evan, you're coming up. Okay? Both a pole lathe and a great wheel lathe was used to make more than 340 chairs recorded in the accounts. Evan will now explain to you what this is, because I have no idea.
What, the Great Lathe?
Yeah.
The Great Lathe is this object here. You can also see a smaller version over there. Basically, it's a hand-cranked lathe that you can make large pieces, anything from a large spindle to a newel post to a tabletop. They especially used it. There's some record of someone making a cross brace auger for it. So you would fit something on the end of it, and you would be able to turn a large. It's only the way to make perfectly round objects. And I'll explain that more when I get into that.
Okay.
That should be enough for now.
Armchairs and side chairs were made in, here we go, the splat back, fiddle back, slat back, and Windsor types. We have some examples of those chairs up here. That's the faux Dominy chair over there, however, okay? There's a faux Dominy chair there, okay? The Dominy templates, that's patterns for furniture parts, such as chair splats or crest rails used by cabinet makers and joiners from the 17th century to the present day, have survived in a greater number than is the case for any American woodworker of the colonial early republic periods. One of the reasons why the Dominies have become so prominent, they left us a lot, and a lot of what they made has been found. Okay? It's a wonderful window into the past when you study the Dominies. By outlining the shape of the template on boards with a scratch awl or a pencil, the craftsman could produce objects in quantity. These and other labor-saving devices hastened the process of cutting, shaping, and assembling pieces made in the shop. Time is money, then and now. These craftsmen worked 10 to 12 hours each day, 6 days a week. It's a romantic notion that craftsmen like the Dominies didn't care about time and took as long as perfection required to complete a piece. They'd starve. Slapback chairs were probably the most popular, and you remember, every slapback chair that you see is not a Dominy chair, okay? Just like this fiddleback. I don't think they even called it that, but the fiddleback design is seen on many chairs, and we've had two different appraisers come to Home Sweet Home while I've been there. Two of them will say the two chairs we have a Dominy. One of them, said one of the two chairs were Dominies. 15 years later, no, possibly Eastern Long Island. The same with the blanket chest that we have in there. I've learned the word attributed to while I'm doing this, right? So the slapback chair was the most common. They made 61 are listed in the accounts between 1796 and 1818 at prices from 4 to 6 shillings. A great slapback armchair, such as the one made for Abraham Sherrill Jr., one of Sherrill Foster's rich ancestors, in 1822, cost 14 shillings and 8 hours of labor to complete. All the circular tops of Dominy stands and tables were made using an arbor and cross, Evan.
That's foreshadowing, it's called.
Oh, okay. The most important piece of lathe equipment to serve in the Dominy tool collection at the Winterthur Museum. Responding to a growing demand in 1795, Nathaniel V had a local blacksmith, Deacon Dave Talmadge, make an arbor and cross for turning stands. That's what you were talking about. Turned legs and joinery were features of a mahogany breakfast table that Nathaniel IV made for his son Felix. By far the most ambitious and expensive piece of furniture in the Dominy's woodworking shop was a maple desk and bookcase made for John Lyon Gardner in 1800. Cost about 20 pounds, 8 shillings. John Lyon Gardner was probably one of the best customers for the Dominies. Now that price, of course, included carting at the fireplace, just opposite Gardner's Island. He spent 5 days making it. It was inherited by Winthrop Gardner Jr. about 1933, and it's now owned by Winterthur. John Lyon Gardner, as I said, was one of the best customers for the Dominies. From 1769 to 1835, the Dominies made at least 34 pieces of furniture for 9 separate members of that rich Sherrill family. Again. Now, but here's where the Dominies, this is one of the reasons now why the Dominies survived. In return for furniture and other goods, the Sherrills supplied the craftsmen with shoes for the daughters of Nathaniel V, working in the Dominy's woodworking shop, field work, carting of wood, rental of a horse, butchering of animals to supply meat, and even hammering out the iron triangle that the Nathaniel IV used to support his clock-gear cutting engine. So the Dominies bartered. It was a barter economy. In exchange for their products, the Dominies also received household goods such as woven coverlets, sundries of earthenware, lined cloth, shoes, skeins of wool, indigo spoons, hats, and blanketing. Customers also paid with foodstuffs, bushels of wheat, corn, rye, oats, spices, rice, beef, mutton, fish, and on and on and on. Gun repairing and stocking of guns were another source of income for the Dominies. In 1800, for example, the Dominies were paid for stocking a gun and also for 2 rifles, 6 pence. Now, although the Dominy craftsmen's claim to fame initially rested on the products of their clock shop, there can be no doubt that they would not have prospered solely from the sale of clocks. As I told you, they made about 1.5 clocks a year. And almost done. Okay. Here we go. Now, by the late 1820s or the early 1830s, time was running out for the makers of handicraft clocks. Steam power had been applied to moving boats. It also had been applied to moving railroad trains and machinery. Goods could be produced cheaper in greater quantity and much faster than was possible by the Dominies in their handicraft shops. In 1828, Sarah Nickel of Islip canceled an order for a clock by writing to Felix Dominy that some of my friends think it such a piece of folly to me to have an expensive clock. In other words, I can get a cheaper clock in Connecticut. You could probably get 5 or 6 clocks at this time for the 1 clock that you would have to buy for the Dominies. For the Dominies to earn a living as a craftsman anymore was like tilting at the windmills that they had built on the eastern end of Long Island. Felix Dominy moved to Babylon by 1835 to become the keeper of the Fire Island Lighthouse. By 1847, he was operating a hotel on Fire Island during the summer and in Bayshore during the winter. Now, what happened to the Dominy clock shop and house and furniture shop? Well, in 1940, the American Building Survey came out here and they took pictures. They thought they were coming out here to take pictures of just the clock shop. So they only took 1 picture, I think, of the furniture shop. All right? It's a good thing they took the pictures at all. That picture back there that you see was, I think, in the American Building. In fact, I don't know if all of these were, if I'm not mistaken, right? I think they all were. Okay. The house is now owned by Oscar Brill. How many people remember Oscar Brill? Of course, he had the store. Now, what are they? Must be an antique store down there now, right? Yeah. Okay. So he tells the mayor, "Look, I'll sell you this house. I bought the house," he says. "I'll sell it to you for $6,000 if you promise to open it up as a museum." So Judd Bannister, the mayor in East Hampton, writes an open letter to the people of East Hampton saying that we can purchase this for $6,000. The outside of the house was bad. He seemed to say in the letter that the inside wasn't. I don't know about that. Guess what the date of the letter is? December 1941. When the war comes, people forget about it. It's torn down in 1946. Okay? Now we hear nothing. Well, yes, this is what happens. The clockmaking and the woodworking tools are loaned to the East Hampton Historical Society to keep them here. Okay? Some of the documents go to the Long Island room. And then the heavy equipment, the benches, the lathes, the risers, the clamps, and other tools wind up in Ethel Marsden's Windmill Antique Store in Southampton. Okay? Now we come to 1957. A guy named Rockwell Gardner is wandering around Southampton, goes in Marsden's Antique Store, and sees the stuff. He knows what it is. Okay? So to make a long story short, he has connections to the Winterthur Museum. The Winterthur Museum then wants to purchase some of the things from Marsden's, and then the East Hampton Historical Society unwittingly sells things from here to Winterthur. Then a Dominy appears on the scene, okay, and says, hey, wait a minute. So the tools are returned to the Dominys, who then donate them to the Winterthur Museum. They have about 200 manuscript items. They have 1,000 tools. They have some clocks and furniture, and they have recreated the Dominy clock and furniture shops in the Winterthur Museum. Okay, so it is being kept. Now, Dean Faley of the Society for the Preservation of Long Island Antiquities. This is almost, well, I'm not even going to say that. All right. Hummel and others who have fashioned a most intensive and comprehensive investigation to date of a related group of American craftsmen, that's the Dominy study, in the context of the community in which they live. It's very, very extensive. It gives the Dominys considerable, but maybe overshadowing fame, okay? Dominys were one piece of the puzzle of how woodworking was done, especially in this area, but they're a very sharply defined piece, okay? Mr. Hummel, of course, says that the furniture also had an elegance of form or arrangement with freedom from all unnecessary additions or embellishments. Now, the customers didn't want urban or fancy work out here because they didn't see it, so they didn't want it. That's one thought. Now, what do I think about the Dominy family, and why is the Dominy furniture, or why are the Dominys important? Okay? I'm not so sure, and now there are people who know more about this than me, okay, that the Dominy furniture we should not be focusing on as being unique, but the Dominys themselves, how they survived for 100 years, and what we know about the furniture they made, how they made it, who they sold it to, how much they charged, how long did it take to make, what goods did they receive when they bartered. We know about their personal lives. We know they were literate. They kept account books. They kept weather diaries. They were interested in religion and politics. Nathaniel Dominy IV purchased a copy of Paradise Lost. He built a house for his daughter that's still standing in Springs. He was a supervisor of East Hampton. He repaired an orrery here at Clinton Academy. Nathaniel V built windmills. Okay, to me, that's one of the true geniuses of the Dominys is the windmills that Nathaniel Dominy V built. Felix Dominy subscribed to local newspapers. He wrote articles for newspapers. He worked on the Montauk Point Lighthouse. He was interested in local Indian life, natural history. There's a bill for tuition for him sending his son to Clinton Academy. So the genius is not so much in the furniture, but the ability to survive for almost 100 years. And if you have a piece of Dominy furniture, you have a piece of East Hampton's history, and you know so much about the people who made it. They're three-dimensional, they're not cardboard cutouts. And I think that's the important thing that we should remember about the Dominy furniture. And I'm out of here now, and now Evan will bore you for about 20 minutes, okay? Do we need to switch? Yeah, okay.
This is the ceremonial transfer of the microphone. as my esteemed colleague was telling you about the Dominy furniture being a part of history, what I'd like to impart to all of you is an idea of what it was like to actually build these pieces. All right. We tend to think of things in modern terms, and we tend to look at these pieces with modern eyes. And I'm going to ask you all with me to go back in time a little bit to when every tool was powered by muscle, human muscle, and when every operation was made by a craftsman. Now, construction of furniture has changed so radically in the last 150 years that I think I'd be fair in saying that the Domini's style of furniture construction was closer to the ancient Egyptians, than it would be to the modern day woodworker. I don't know how many of you have actually made furniture in your own spare time, but try to imagine making furniture without table saws, without joiners or thickness planers, without routers, most importantly, without sanders, without sheets of plywood being driven to your shop, without wood, which is dressed on all four sides. Basically, you are starting off with a set of plans and a dead tree. So that's back before electricity, back when these people were operating since ancient times with 5 fundamental machines. The 5 fundamental machines are the wheel and axle, the lever, the pulley. These 3 are very important, if not indispensable, but the most important to the woodworker are the screw and the inclined plane or wedge. All right, to start off, you have a large piece of wood. There were sawmills, but a lot of the planking was done by the cabinet makers themselves. An example is the Dominies had a whipsaw. A whipsaw is a large 2-man saw for sawing planks. Interestingly enough, they owned it in partnership with one of the Conklins. It was not a tool you would use all that often, as indispensable as it was. All right, so you've sawed your tree into planks. You now dry it for about 2 hours. Then you obviously have to make it into smaller and manageable. Furniture making is about taking a large piece of wood, a tree, cutting into small pieces, and putting it back together into large pieces again. So you would need then bow saws. Then a very useful saw, which you had up here. This is sometimes called a veneer saw, but it's a planking saw. When these things are tightened, and this one's not in the greatest condition, being 150 years old, you can saw planks which are fairly uniform in thickness. It is not easy. Then smaller still. Because of construction, you would use back saws and dovetail saws. You have to understand you didn't have screws then. Glue cannot be trusted. It's hide glue, and you are living out here at the corner of Humidity and Central. So things are going to move like crazy. There are nails. What did... I remember Felix had something nice about... He had a joke about nails. Why is a nail drove into the ceiling like an old man? Because they are both infirm. All right, so now you've got enough to make a box. But people didn't want just boxes. They wanted a certain amount of ornamentation. Obviously, not a lot of ornamentation, but a certain amount. So now you have to shape the wood. And this is where the inclined wedge or plane comes in. In this case, in the form of chisels or in the form of planes. To explain the inclined plane, it's real simple. Let's say you want to make a square mortise in a piece of wood. You can take a blunt, square piece of metal, and you can hammer it into the wood and make a perfectly square hole into the wood with about 3,000 pounds of pressure. That was not available for most people. So what you do is you bevel. You put a bevel on the wood. The more acute the bevel, the less force that is needed, until the angle gets so acute that you lose the edge. This allows one person with their God-given muscles to drive something into wood and either use it for paring, for mortising, for turning, whatever. It also allows you to plane, because you do the same thing with the knife inside a plane. You sharpen it to an angle, and instead of just trying to scrape a piece of metal, you are now shearing off. All right. All right, so the first incline or plage are 3 kinds of chisels, right? We have a paring chisel, which is used for cleaning up corners, for carving. This is probably the most often used. This is a turning chisel. This is used with the great lathe. You put it up against a piece of wood to hold the bar, and then the other wood turns into it, and great pieces of wood go flying off, and eventually you end up with a spindle. Then you have a mortising chisel, quite like the paring chisel. The only difference is it is much thicker this way because this takes a great deal of hammering. All these need to be sharpened frequently. We'll get into more than that. You sharpen them on a grindstone, which they had a nice one upstairs, and then you hone it on an oil stone or on a water stone. How sharp can you get chisels? I brought one of my, this is a modern day chisel. When you get it sharp enough, it will take the hair right off your arm. I don't know if you can see that back there. That is how sharp you need to get a chisel to work it. They lose their edge very quickly, so you are constantly sharpening it. Luckily, that's the apprentice's job. After a while, you stop doing it. All right, now into planes. Every situation, every curve, and every shape needs its own plane. That means you're going to have roughing planes, smoothing planes, jack, fore, beading, rabbiting, plowing, coopering, joining, and most important, molding planes. Now the Dominies listed, I think, 106 different planes in their collection. I was looking upstairs and I could only estimate, I think there were over 500 planes up there. Planes at the time we're talking about, which are the 1700s and the late 1700s, mid 1800s, were almost all wooden planes, preferably beech. Beech is a good wood. Metal is hard to come by in the United States at that time, and it's also hard to shape. You have to make your own planes. We had a real problem with cast steel, and most of the cast steel had to come from England, which meant if you were ordering a plane with a specific shape, you could wait months. It was incredibly expensive. What the craftsmen did do, though, was they ordered their knives, just a blank knife. Just so everyone knows, the knife is the metal part that comes out of the plane. Once you have a knife, a nice sharp piece of metal, if you stop using this particular plane, you end up grinding down the knife for something else. As you can see, this is a coopering plane. This is for making a curve. If you had a smaller curve, you'd use a smaller coopering plane. Okay, you want to start off with, let's say we're starting off with a piece of wood. We need a jack plane. Unfortunately, I could not find a jack plane up there. Jack plane is one of your basic planes. It's about this big. It's got a high angle on the blade, and you go across the grain. What you use that to is to flatten it. Then you use a smoothing plane, which is pretty much the same, but it's a lower angle. You level it off. Then you use a joining plane. This will true up all the edges. Will make everything straight. All right? Then let's say, what else would you want to do? Let's say you want to do some construction. You want to put this together. So now you're going to need some kind of a plow plane. Let me see where, this would be a plow plane where you go in and you can make a single groove into the wood to put it together. And then there are the molding planes. I mean, there are literally thousands of molding planes. Every molding, this is a good example of it. I mean, this is a very big molding. But every molding needs its own plane. And consequently, this piece has to be built, has to be shaped, and then the metal has to be ground and sharpened. It is not an easy job. This was the apprentice job. And it's interesting, the apprentice, his relationship to sharpening, because the apprentice basically cleaned the shop, got food for everyone, and sharpened things. And the graduation from apprentice to journeyman, the apprentice would make a plane, usually an ornamental plane. I actually brought some of my own planes here because one of the problems with museums is you can't touch anything. And one of the things about tools is if you don't hold it in your hand, you have no idea what it feels like. So people can just pass this around. This was made by an apprentice, I'm not sure quite about the date, about 150 years ago to mark his transition to a journeyman. As a journeyman, he could be given one facet of a job and be expected to finish it. He was also expected to build a toolbox and a bench. Benches are one of the most important tools you are going to have because it's the tool you're on the most. It has to be able to hold the wood, it has to be extremely sturdy. And there's an interesting note, which the Dominy benches are listed at 32 inches, which is 4 inches shorter than a standard bench. A bench is supposed to come down to your wrist, and I'm not sure if the Dominys were short. I don't know if anyone knows, or hunched over. You weren't. Yeah. I imagine everyone was shorter, but 4 inches is fairly short. And of course, when a journeyman went to become a master, he would make the masterpiece, which is this could be considered a masterpiece. This very fine cherry. How you work these things is, because there's no way to get the blade in and out. You tap down with a hammer. This would make it go down, and to make it go back a little bit, you tap front or back. I'll also let you this. This is a really beautifully made, it's a rabbiting plane. A rabbet is a groove in a wood that you use for construction. Another really important tool that these people are going to be using, which is based on the screw, actually there are a lot, is the screw is important. Clamps are an example of screw. When I say screw, I don't mean the screws that you put in. There's almost no screws in the older furniture. But more importantly, the screw is, when you're making chairs, chairs are a series of holes and things to go in the holes. You have to make extremely correctly sized holes. So there are 3 ways to make a hole. There's the famous brace and bit. This is actually a rather lovely one, which is good for smaller holes, but really doesn't stand up to the larger holes. If you've got a larger hole, you need a real tool. And I'll let you guys pass this around, and you get an idea of how hard this thing was to operate. I mean, it's a heavy thing. This is only good for the softer woods. I think once you got to hard maple, you would probably have to go to what's known as a spoon bit auger. That's a regular auger. This spoon bit is broken over, but normally this would be razor sharp, and this would work more effectively for a hardwood. Okay, now you've got your holes. You need to put something in the holes. You need dowels, you need spindles. And that, of course, is the great lathe, which the great lathe was mostly for the large newel posts. This turntable was probably made on that. It was powered by the unfortunate apprentice who would be there for 2 hours at a time, probably cranking. They're weighted, there's a beautiful one over there, and you can see the wheel is very thick. It's weighted with sand to give it more momentum once it gets going. Now they did have one-man lathes, treadle or spindle, but the way they worked is as you pressed back and forth, the stock would go back and forth, which is okay, but you can only cut when it's going down, or else the chisel flies up in the air. So it slowed you down quite a bit. The other thing these people didn't have was sandpaper. Now, modern day furniture is sanded to death. Nobody planes anymore. Nobody has to get it within 1/8 of an inch. You just sand it flat, and if there's a part that doesn't match up, you put a little wood fill in, you sand that too. They didn't have sandpaper. They used spoke shaves. This is a great little tool. This is how you shape all the legs. You can either push that or pull that. Obviously, pulling is a little bit easier than pushing. But then for the really fine work, it's a very simple tool. You take a flat piece of metal, a little bit under a 1/16 inch wide, like a little rectangle, and you flatten that edge as much as you can. I mean, you get it dead flat, you polish it, it's so flat, and then with a very hard piece of metal, you bend over that flat corner. It's hard to imagine, but you set up a tiny burr, like a piece of glass. This is called a cabinet scraper. You can just press it along. It makes the thinnest shavings you will ever imagine. You don't need to go with the grain. You can even go cross grain with it. You can even use, what they also use too, is broken glass. Broken glass will scrape it very much. This ends up with a very different look. When we sand things, we clog the grain up and we flatten everything out. Now when you plane or scraper plane the grain, especially on the open grain woods, the oaks and the ashes, stays very, very hollow. So when you put stain on it, the grain just jumps out at you. And this is more that you would notice on the open grain woods. And this is one of the reasons that I find antique furniture to be so much more beautiful than modern furniture. It doesn't have that muddiness that modern furniture often has. Obviously, making furniture this way took a great deal of dedication. It was a lot more difficult. This wasn't so much of a hobby for these people. It really and required being given from one generation to the other. One of the things I liked about the Dominies particularly was the pithy little sayings that they would put on their pieces, which I thought showed a lot of forethought. The clocks, there's one clock that says, "Time, oh, how precious." And the other one is, "Time is, it flies anon, time was." And then there's a really cheery one that I love, which is, "Hark, what's the cry? Prepare to meet thy God today." And before I go, I'd like to add one that I find appropriate because, well, it's from the Apocrypha, and it refers to craftsmen like the Dominies, and I thought certainly the Dominies would appreciate it. And saying of the craftsmen, "But they keep stable the fabric of the world, and their prayer is in the practice of their trade." Well, thank you.
Anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Yes?
Are there any recognizable elements in any of the furniture that's saying it's something that tells you the Dominies?
Well, first of all, we have the Bible, which is Hummel's book, with hammer in hand. With hammer in hand, all arts do stand, all arts do stand with hammer in hand. So that's one way that we've identified them, but I've learned to really appreciate, I did this before, but I really appreciate the work that people like Richard Barons does of the Southampton Historical Museum, maybe Mr. Morgan McWhinney, Mr. Hummel, and Mr. Faley, when they're going around identifying pieces of furniture and attributing them to somebody. It's unbelievable. Here I'm wandering through the book, and I said, aha, I got it. This is the 1788 clock that was made for Mr. Hunting by Nathaniel Dominy, because we think it was made by the Dominy because, first of all, Mr. Hummel found other clocks that had the six covered up a little bit, showing the Dominy a little shadow over the 12. So I think he's looking for common characteristics. But the beauty was, you see the dark lines, the heavy, thick lines? They're going the same way except for the 9. It's going the other way. So, is it a Dominy clock? Mr. Hummel says it is. Okay? He also discovered here, I'm going to use my Bob Hefner special pointer now, Bob. You're not the only one who uses it. Oh, not like, you know, okay. On PowerPoint, I'm using PowerPoint, everybody. Okay? You see that? Mr. Hummel said that that's why I opened the clock up and I showed it, that triangular support, he did not find that on almost any other Dominy clock that he has looked at or located. So he's either said that the Dominy who built it borrowed it from another clock, or he was into inventing, okay? This piece, okay, right away it's a Dominy piece, sure. Well, there was a man working in Southampton called Caleb Cooper, I believe. The Southampton Historical Museum has that piece, right, Richard? Yeah. Well, Mr. Faley says that this is from Eastern Long Island. Hummel attributes it to Nathaniel Dominy, the 4th and the 5th. So what I'm trying to tell you is, the Dominies never wrote inside their furniture. See, that's the biggie. For example, they made 12 chests about like this, they think. This one, Mr. Faley says, has the original paint and the original hardware. It's very difficult to date these, he says, however, because they made these from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So if you want to look at the hardware, I'll date it by the hardware. Well, sometimes they reuse the hardware. Hello. So, I guess my answer is, I know that Nathaniel Dominy built a shot mold in 1779. You know why? He wrote his name on it, 1779. There is a Dominy up there on the name on it. I found a clock from 1807, from 1809, but I couldn't find one in the book 1808. So anyway, so I don't know if I answered your question, but I did talk a lot.
I have to say that when, in the 20s, when my mother got interested in antique furniture, and we had a lot of Dominy chairs and things, so she looked it up, and this guy named Hyler Held from Scalia Society of Preservation of Long Island Antiquaries, he called them that chair, like that chair there, Long Island Dutch flat back chair with a Connecticut variant. So she's going around telling everybody that's the type of chair she had. But now they have found out that because of the templates, that was a Dominy chair.
But now other people, you're going to find chairs like this in other areas, chairs like this in other areas, I think. And the candle stands, I mean, they're not, right?
They're not that unique. What you can do is you can match up the known templates to the actual pieces.
That's another answer to your question. Thank you, Evan. That's right. They found a lot of the templates. And you know what they also had at the Domini House that we lost? I think we lost them. They had the forms for making the sails on the windmills, I think. Is that right?
The gears were drawn on the attic floor.
I'm sorry, what?
The patterns of the mill gears drawn on the attic floor.
Yeah.
They all went together.
How many people have not been in one of the windmills on Eastern Long Island? Have not? All right. All right. Other questions?
Just an historical note, Henry DuPont, who founded Furniture, and he was a direct descendant of Nathaniel III. His great-great-grandmother was Deborah Dominy, who married Jeremiah King from the North Fork.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Wow.
I didn't know that connection.
Any other questions?
Some of these pieces were paid for and what was the fence? What would have been?
Oh, well, all right. The Dominies charged about 94 cents a day for their labor. Chairs, I don't know, money is crazy. All I can tell you is that the chairs were affordable, okay? This, you'd have to, I think, have money. The clocks were not affordable for people. The blank chest, I'm not sure of, but, they made so many of these chairs, so. But I mean, remember now, the Dominies did not always take money. They gave credit and they bartered, so. One of these days I'm going to find the book that tells you all about the money and how it's done. I haven't found it yet, so I really can't.
Wasn't the clock shop moved down to somebody's?
Oh, thank you, yes. In 1946, right before they tore down the Domini House, Dudley Robbins, and he told me this personally. So this is actually one of the few correct things I probably said tonight, right? He told me this personally, that he took the clock-making shop and the furniture-making shop, and he wanted to give them to the East End Historical Society. But this is 1947, this is around 1946, 47. The Historical Society was in the process of attempting during this time, I think, to get the Mulford House and the Mulford Farm. So nobody answered him. So he took it up to his estate, and he built, like, I don't know, bathhouses is not the right, 2 little cottages, and one of them is still standing. Okay? So that's what happened to those. And Dudley Robbins told me this himself, so, unless he was fibbing. Yes, Mr. Dominy in the back.
His folklore that the Dominiques sent their chairs to the Montauk Indians for weaving of the seats. Any truth in that?
I have not found that at all. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist, okay? But I have not found it. In fact, the chair up here we have has a replacement seat. That's like a leather seat in it.
All of them do now.
Yeah, oh really? Yeah.
Of course, the original, there's that story.
Oh, I never heard that one. Well, let's just keep telling it then. Richard?
There's some reference in the 1920s, an antiquarian was interviewing a chair repairman out here. And I think this reference is in one of the old antiques magazines. And that's the first reference to the use of the Montaukets for making chair seats. We know that in Southampton, Sanford in the 1810s was using shinnikons for chair seats. And we have 2 Dominy chairs and 2 Stanford chairs, and those chair seats are unlike any other chair seats. And there is someone who's working on studying the rush seats of Eastern unlike any other seats, but, you know, the jury's still out.
Oh, thank you, Richard. And they're original, they're original intact?
Yeah, they're very, very different.
In the old business. Well, why don't we stop and you can come up and look at the tools and look at some of the furniture and have some more wine.